we're going to get started with Krissi Vandenberg, who's going to be speaking on the most important thing you can do to help the animals and enjoy every minute of it. Now, Krissi Vandenberg began as a volunteer in 1998 and has served as the executive director of Vegan Action since bringing the organization to Richmond, Virginia in 2000. She has been vegan since 1995, inspired by Friends and the British cook zine, Soy Not Oi. She was a co-founder of Richmond Animal Rights Network and holds a Bachelor's of Science in Biology, a Master's of Science in Sociology, and a certificate in nonprofit management from Virginia Commonwealth University. Her passions are punk ethics, hugging trees, feminism, raising a son named Arrow, adopting animals, conversations on ethics, and making the best lentil loaf in town. She has presented at universities and conferences speaking on issues of ethics, veganism, women's empowerment, and body image and self-esteem. Vegan Action is the organization she is the director of, is a national organization working to eliminate animal suffering, reduce environmental impacts, and improve human health. They aim to educate and inspire people to become vegan for the animals, for the environment, and for their health. And you can find more about Vegan Action at vegan.org. And I'm honored to present Krissi Vandenberg, a friend, a colleague, and just an amazing person. So here we go, Krissi.
Thank you, Gabriel. I appreciate it. Okay, so I just wanted to ask everyone that's here today, and this seems like a good place to ask, is how many people are animal lovers? Okay, I figured there'd be a lot here today. So most people do call themselves animal lovers, and a third of people polled have stated that they believe animals should have some level of rights. However, 98% of the US population eats animals. So, of course, I find that kind of confusing. The first time I learned that statistic, I was in college, and I immediately felt mad. I felt angry. That was my very first response to that. And so I started learning more. I watched some videos, read some information, and I became the angry vegan. And it actually felt really good. I loved being mad. I loved being angry. I went to every protest I could go to. I yelled, I screamed, I shamed people, and I even felt hatred sometimes towards people because I just couldn't understand why they could know what they know, see what they see, and not make a change. It didn't make sense to me. And the main statistic that really sticks out to me is that 80 billion animals are killed every year for food. 80 billion animals. Sentient animals. These are cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, turkeys, just to end up on someone's plate. And if you ask someone to come up with the most horrible way to torture and kill an animal, that's exactly what's happening in factory farms. They are living in the most horrible, inhumane conditions, living terrible lives, and then are thrown onto trucks, driven sometimes hundreds of miles, to end up at the slaughterhouse and being horribly, inhumanely killed, to be cut up, put into packages, and end up on someone's plate. It's a horrible, horrible process and industry that is killing so many animals every year on our planet. And I do want to just remind you, and if you heard Karen Davis speak earlier, she talked about the myth of humane farming or humane slaughter. There is no such thing. Anytime anyone raises animals for profit, they're a commodity. And their well-being, other than just being able to stay alive until they get slaughtered, is all that matters. So them having enough space, not experiencing any emotional trauma, pain or suffering is not relevant. It's all about maximizing profit and making money off of animals' bodies and products. Nobody raises animals for the fun of it and then sells those things for money. It's just mutually exclusive. So the first thing I learned about was the dairy industry. And as I started learning more and more, I was kind of thinking about myself growing up. So I had this idea that cows lived really happy, wonderful lives out in a pasture, in a grassy field, and that they just make milk. And cows have to be milked or they would be in a lot of pain. Because that really is what is portrayed to us. But of course, as we know, cows are mammals and they have to give birth in order to make milk. And so then I learned the life of a dairy cow is one of the worst, most excruciating lives that a farm animal lives. They live in confinement their whole lives. They are artificially inseminated. As soon as they give birth, their calf is immediately taken away. And they are hooked up to a milking machine several times a day. And continue that process for several years until their milk production becomes so low that it's not worth it to keep them alive anymore, and then they're sent off to slaughter. Their calves that are taken away from them as soon as they're born, the female calves are kept on the dairy farm and are put into the same cycle to do the same thing that their mother was done and become another dairy cow. The male calves are put into tiny veal crates. And if you've had a chance to walk by the vegan action table over here, we have a demo of one. They vary in size, but for the most part, they're designed so that the veal calf cannot move around. The idea is that the veal calf cannot develop any muscle tissue. So it's just tender meat. And they're kept alive on a liquid slurry for several weeks until they're shipped off to slaughter. So it's an incredibly horribly cruel cycle and a life that all of these animals live. Pigs are also artificially inseminated. Sows live in tiny gestation crates their whole lives. They give birth to a litter of piglets. They are permitted to nurse the piglets for a little while, but of course they're kept separate from the piglets in these gestation crates between bars so that they don't roll over and squish the piglets. And the piglets are taken away within a few weeks. And again, the females are kept on the farm so that they can grow up to be sows and do the same thing. And then the males are kept on the farm to feed for a while and are sent off to slaughter. And I'm guessing a lot of you here have probably seen pictures or videos of some of the things that I'm talking about. A lot more information and videos have surfaced over the years to help educate folks a little bit more on what's really going on. Also, as Karen had mentioned, chickens, a greater number of chickens are slaughtered every year than any other animal. And some would argue live the absolute worst lives. So battery hens are kept in these tiny cages. Their beaks are cut off so they can't injure the other chickens that they are shoved into this tiny cage to live with, laying eggs. These cages are stacked up on each other in these huge warehouse areas. There's no sunlight, but the lights are kept on in these long chicken houses, usually 24 hours because that increases egg production. So again, the farmers want to get the maximum amount of eggs out of these chickens as quickly as possible. And then once the egg production starts to decrease for these laying hens, they are shoved in a truck and sent off to slaughter. So again, that's another one of those things that a lot of folks think, well, if I'm eating eggs, the chicken isn't harmed. Chickens have to lay eggs, and that is true. Chickens do naturally lay eggs. These chickens are living horrible lives, but they still end up on these terrible trucks and are sent off to slaughter like every other chicken. Has anyone ever passed one of those trucks on the highway? It's a horrible, horrible thing to see. I've seen one with pigs before and one with chickens, and it's just the most awful thing to actually see in real life, these animals on their way to slaughter. Broiler hens are chickens that are raised for their meat. So they live in these huge chicken houses, which Gabriel and I have actually visited. There are these huge facilities, no sunlight, no air, and these chickens are fed to grow as rapidly as possible And in about 12 weeks, they are then put on those trucks that I was talking about that we often see and shipped off to slaughter. And it's just important for us to know and be able to share with people that there are no happy farms. There are no small family farms that are providing food at grocery stores or restaurants. And I think that's one of those myths that people try to tell themselves, that, well, you know, the chicken on the package of the eggs looks really happy and it says pasture raised. But again, we just have to remind ourselves, if people are raising animals to make money off of them, then their basic needs are all that are being met. They're being fed so that they can stay alive. That is it. So we have to think about what we're comfortable paying our money for. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that we're paying for unless we choose not to. So we can choose to not consume animals. It's that simple. It's supply and demand. So if we as people demand these products, they will be supplied to us. If we stop demanding them, there will be less and less. So it's the power of boycott. It's the power of using your dollar in a way that you feel comfortable with, in a way that you feel is right and just. But most people, about 95% of people in the US, aren't doing that. And it made me angry. And I still feel angry about it. And there's the environmental impacts of animal agriculture. So agricultural waste is the #1 pollutant in our country. Some of that is pesticides and fertilizers that are used on crops, but a great portion of that is from manure that is leaking into our waterways. So again, I mentioned earlier, 80 billion animals, that's global. So let's just think about how many of those are in the US and how much waste comes from that many animals. Cows, pigs, chickens, goats, turkeys, and it has to go somewhere. Is it going in landfills? Is it going in some containers? Is it going in waste lagoons? A lot of these are open areas. If it's not being sprayed on crops, which is legal in most states, it's hanging out in open area lagoons and with heavy rains are leaching right into our rivers and streams. And 1/3 of the US population depends on rivers and streams for fresh drinking water. And that water is in really terrible shape, as you could imagine. So, and of course, not only for humans, but there are animals that live in those rivers and streams. There are animals that depend on that water to survive as well. So animal agriculture is just kind of ruining everything, to be honest with you, and it's just getting worse. Has anyone ever driven past a cattle feedlot? Right, yeah. So I did once when I was driving back from California, passing through Texas. And I smelled it before I saw it. And it took about 35 to 40 minutes of driving before I was finished passing it. So you can imagine how many miles that was, how many acres of barren land, of cattle just compacting that soil, hanging out and waiting there to go to slaughter. So the humane aspect of that not existing. And then again, all I could think of course, because of the smell, was the amount of waste that all of those animals are producing, and where does it go? Where does it go? And then you start to think about, okay, so what's happening globally? That's what I see happening in Texas. So we know overgrazing is a major global issue now because of the demand for beef. So we know that the rainforests are being cut down at an unprecedented rate in South and Central America to raise cattle. And a lot of that beef is coming to the United States. And this is land, this is soil that will never be able to recuperate the same, that will never be able to be the same forest ecosystem ever again. So there are extreme consequences that come from these choices that we're making for food. So do you get why I'm feeling angry? And yeah, it's clear, right? And of course, we know the Earth is warming at an unprecedented rate. So sea levels are rising, global temperatures are rising, we know glaciers are melting, sea ocean levels are becoming more acidic. And the scientific consensus that this is because carbon dioxide levels in the air are increasing because of human behavior. So it's choices that we as humans are making that are affecting the health of our planet. And animal agriculture greatly contributes to this rise in greenhouse gases. Animal agriculture contributes 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than all transportation combined. So a lot of folks think it must be the cars, the tractor trailer trucks, all of the driving, which of course is contributing, but it doesn't even compare to the greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture. It's also really important to know about slaughterhouse work. Slaughterhouse work is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, as you could imagine, and it's also incredibly underpaid. Approximately 38% of slaughterhouse workers in the US are undocumented, so these folks don't have the same rights as other folks, and they don't have a voice. A lot of these folks working in slaughterhouses are working with injuries. They're not getting bathroom breaks. They are not being treated appropriately, and if they risk saying anything, they're threatened with being fired or even deported. It's a horrible, horrible job, as you can imagine. Nobody wakes up and says, I want to work at a slaughterhouse. People end up working at slaughterhouses because that's the only option. Sometimes if English is their second language, if they can't read or write, if they live in a rural area and that's the only place to work, that's their only option a lot of times. But I can't help but think if we changed the demand of what we want, that could be a farm. That could be a farm where people could be growing and harvesting organic produce instead. And what a much healthier place to work that would be. So kind of going back to when I first learned about all of this information in college, so I kept yelling, I kept protesting, I kept being really, really angry, and for a while it felt good, it felt exciting, and then after a few years I started looking around and thinking, I'm not sure if I'm making the impact that I want to be making, and I'm not really seeing a lot changing. So I paused and just kind of wondered, why is there this disconnect? And what can I do different? Because what I'm doing doesn't seem to be working. I want to know what I can do different. So I finally stopped yelling, and I started asking questions, and I started listening. And that's where I really began to learn why people didn't want to change what they were eating. And there were 4 main reasons that I kept hearing over and over again. The first one was tradition and culture. A lot of folks eat what they know everyone else around them is eating, what they've grown up eating, what their friends and family eat. And eating is more than just what you put in your mouth. It is a part of identity. It marks rituals, it marks celebrations and special events. And a lot of people are really tied to what they eat, and it's really important, and it's hard to let that go. That was important information for me to know and to learn. The next one, of course, is habit. That one you've maybe heard. We are creatures of habit, and we tend to do what we've always done, what seems to work. It's the path of least resistance. It takes the least amount of energy. It's the easiest thing to do. So we tend to just continue to eat what we've eaten. And that was also important to know too. The third one is convenience. And while that has changed a lot, it was definitely challenging to be vegan in 1994 in Richmond, Virginia. That has changed tremendously. But it's still relevant. It's the foods that are most convenient to everyone are animal-based foods, And those animal-based foods are full of fat and sugar, which we crave. And so it's not surprising to hear. But that leads to the last one, which is the most common one I hear, and it's also the hardest one to hear, which is taste. Because that's just related to desire. But we know that's really powerful. Everyone talks, when you ask someone how your food was, it tasted amazing. So we love to talk about how food tastes. It's hard to let that go. But interestingly enough, if you ask most vegans why they stopped eating animals and animal products, they're going to tell you it's because they decided they weren't comfortable doing it, not because they didn't like the taste of it. I grew up eating animals, and I really loved eating fried chicken. And to be completely honest, when I smell fried chicken now, my mouth still waters. And it sounds confusing, but that's how I grew up. That's what I grew up eating. And I didn't stop eating it because I didn't like it. And meat eaters actually appreciate hearing me say that, because they do have the impression that vegans are vegan because they just don't like eating meat, or they never really got into it. It's important to be honest, if that is who you are and that's how you grew up. So I also grew up as an animal lover, always since I can remember. And so I'm going to tell you a story to kind of connect all of this together. When I was in high school, I went to a music festival in Washington, D.C., and someone handed me a pamphlet on factory farms. And what was interesting is that I had one vegetarian friend in high school. This was in the 80s. And he had been talking to me about vegetarianism. He knew I was an animal lover. So I was already kind of thinking about it. It was in there. He had planted the seed. And then I got that pamphlet at that festival, and I brought it home. And I had an opportunity to sit down, read it, see some of the photos. It was cows being slaughtered, and it was enough. That worked for me, and that's what I needed, and I became vegetarian that day. 5 years later, I'm in college, still vegetarian, and I meet a friend of a friend who's vegan. So I'm curious, like, hey, tell me about this vegan thing, what's going on? And he was really kind and patient about it, and he told me about what was happening with dairy cows. He told me what was happening with chickens, and that eating animal products really is just as awful as eating the animals, and really took the time to explain to me that it makes a difference by not eating animal products. And we just had some really good conversations, and that did it for me. Again, I was already kind of thinking about it. I was already, I think, on that path. And it just took me talking to the right person and having a really good open conversation, and I became vegan. And that really was also the trajectory starting me on my activism path, which, as I mentioned earlier, I started out as the angry vegan. And I was the angry vegan for a couple years. And I don't regret it. I'm actually really grateful for that part of my journey, because I was able to really dive in and learn a lot and feel all the feelings and figure out what worked and what didn't work. And it helped me be the amazing activist that I believe I now am 25 years later. So I'm really grateful for that time. So what I needed to start realizing was, how can I have these conversations with other people? This is what worked for me. And I've realized that the yelling and the being angry towards other people isn't working. So being angry with other people for their choices is not working, I'm realizing. So I start to think, how can I get these conversations started? What are the questions I can ask? And I decided, okay, I'm gonna go back to those 4 things that I learned. The reasons people don't want to change their eating habits, right? Tradition and culture, habit, convenience, and taste. And I can find common ground with anybody on any of those 4 things. I believe it. I really do. And what else I've learned in the last 25 years is that almost everyone you ever talk to really most people really do love animals. Most people really do care about the environment. And most people really do want to be healthier. So I think it's safe to assume that people really do want to learn something from us, that we have something great we can share with folks that will help them learn and help them live better lives. So I do make that assumption that I do have something I can share. What really has turned things around for me is I find joy in it now. I have joy in activism. I love having conversations with people. At the Richmond Vegetarian Festival 2 weeks ago, a man came up to the table and he kind of did a lean in and he was like, "Good for you, I could never do it, I love meat," and kind of looked like he was about to keep walking away. And I said, no, wait, we have something in common. And he was like, what? And I was like, yeah, I used to love the taste of meat too. So he actually turned around and came back. And I was like, I'm with you, man. I grew up eating animals. I liked the taste of it, but I learned about what's going on. And I decided to make a change. I decided to change what I was doing. And this is why. We had a conversation about it. He even took a piece of literature, which was, couldn't believe. So I look back on that. I don't know if he made a diet change or not. I probably will never know. I'll probably never see him again. But I do consider that conversation a success because I think that he assumed I was going to roll my eyes at him or ignore him or not really care. But he is the person I want to talk to. I want to talk to meat eaters. Those are the folks I want to have conversations with. Because remember, 98% of the animals on this planet are killed for food. So the most impact I can have as an activist in my lifetime is to encourage as many people as possible to stop eating animals. That's what I can do. If 98% of animals are being killed for food, convincing as many people as possible to eat as few animals as possible is the greatest impact I can have. So I try to have as many conversations as I can. I try to connect with people, and this is what you can do too. People love to hear stories. People love to hear a journey. So think about what your story is and think about sharing your journey with other people and try it out. Try telling people what you do different that's made you a better person, that makes you feel better. And I guarantee you they're going to really enjoy hearing it. So what can you do today if you're not already vegan? You can start eating plant-based foods whenever they're available, as much as you can. That's number one. The second thing I want to ask you to do today is to try to encourage other people in your lives to eat as many plant-based foods as possible. It's better for the environment, it's better for the animals, and it is better for their health. We know that for a fact. So get out there, start having conversations, and really enjoy them every chance that you get. Thank you guys so much. Question? I was a little concerned about the weather. I actually cut my talk a little bit short, but I'll take them if y'all are still comfortable. Right, yeah, that's a good question. So while I had shared that my path and my journey involves being the angry vegan and sort of going through that path, that I don't regret it, but I do love to encourage folks to start out with positivity. If I could share that tip, it did save me, it could save a lot of time. I think that approaching people with kindness, compassion, and positivity is always going to be a better way to open up and have a conversation. Because think about it, if somebody approaches you and tries to convince you of something and they guilt you, they shame you, they get in your face and they start accusing you of something, I shut down. I have no interest in having a conversation with that person. Even encourage new activists and new vegans is to start out open and positive. You're gonna have more conversations and you're gonna have more positive results that way. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Can you talk about how you raised your son?
Yes, yeah. I have a 14-year-old son who I did raise vegan. all throughout my pregnancy, and the grandparents weren't really happy about it. I was able to find a pediatrician that was really positive, and my midwife was actually vegetarian, so that was really helpful. And I found a lot of information online. Actually, the Vegetarian Resource Group has a lot of really good information that was really helpful for me. This was in 2004, and I think they have a table here today, don't they? But they were a really helpful resource for me in 2004 with information on vegan pregnancy and raising vegan children, and also providing really good information debunking the don't eat soy foods myth or don't feed your male children soy foods. So I was really also grateful to have access to that information. So that was a really great resource for me. And he's a wonderful, happy, healthy, solid kid. So I'm excited for you raising a vegan child, Erica. It's wonderful.
How did you?
Right. Yeah. So I haven't raised him to expect him to be an activist. I've definitely given a lot of space to my son Arrow to make those decisions. If he wants to come to the vegetarian festival, if he wants to participate in any way, I definitely give him that freedom to choose. Of course, I've always packed his lunches since he was tiny to take to school. And he will sometimes come home and tell me, my friends keep saying I'm supposed to be drinking milk, that milk's really healthy. And I'm like, oh, well, did you say something to them? And he's like, yeah, I told them and it's not. And I was like, okay, that's great. But if he opted to not say anything at all, I would have been okay with that too. So I think that giving him the freedom of not expecting anything has been the best decision, because then he has his own voice. Thank you.